And so the Burgundian Wars, in many ways, it's the field artillery overcome. Now, at both Granson and Murat, a side with heavy artillery was decisively beaten by the side with no artillery. Now, the Burgundian Wars were Burgundy fighting against the Swiss cantons. And at the Battle of Granson, after the first line of Swiss pikemen were repelled by Burgundian artillery, the Burgundian knights advanced, unwisely, as it has to be said, soon to be overrun by a second wave of Swiss pike assaults. Now, this could be a really intriguing moment in the history of warfare. For the brief period of time, the Swiss pikeman becomes the premier soldier of European history. And technologically, it's a backward step in many ways, as the terror of Europe has become a man with a particularly long stick, but great discipline. And so the Swiss way of war is to use these pike blocks to overcome any heavy cavalry, to simply absorb ranged fire, and to swarm across a battlefield and effectively jab your opponent into submission. Now, 3 months later, at the Battle of Murat, the Burgundians are eager for revenge over these Swiss pikemen, and they're dug in with heavy artillery, ready to fire, and they think that the heavy artillery will simply devastate these closely packed Swiss pike blocks. And indeed, that's what we would presume, that the defeat at the Battle of Granson was because the heavy cavalry had got out of control. They should have relied upon the heavy artillery to blast holes into the Swiss pike blocks. And so surely at Murat they'll take their revenge. And that is their plan, to use the heavy artillery to crack open these Swiss pike blocks. Now, the day of the Battle of Murat, as it happens, the Burgundian army was due to be paid. It was payday. And only a quarter of the army actually remained at the earthworks guarding the heavy artillery, and the rest went to go and collect their pay and also to shelter from the heavy rain. Now, the Swiss columns of pikemen came storming out of the rain towards these thinned lines of Burgundian troops, and they took the defences unprepared, with the guns unable to fire because of the heavy rain. And strange as that might sound, we can obviously say that the Swiss pikeman has achieved great victory here because of a number of contributing factors. But for the next 40 years, the Swiss way of war and the Swiss mercenary dominates the battlefield. And yet, when we look at the role of the artillery, which is believed to be useless after Granson and Murat, they're saying, well, the artillery has been overcome by the Swiss pikeman. The Swiss pikeman is the future of warfare. But the artillery had been badly supported, and its time would come. And again, we look at the words of the great Charles the Man. He says, the comparison of the Assegi and the Martini Henry at Izan-Lawana is similar to the comparison of the Swiss pikemen and the heavy artillery at Granson and Murat. Just because victory is achieved, it doesn't necessarily mean that the one weapon system is superior to the other. And so, but looking at the English warfare of the time, artillery is insignificant in the Wars of the Roses. England is fighting itself, and it's doing so in its favoured way of the longbow and the bill. And so it's a bit of a dead end for the history of warfare, really. England is fighting itself, and it's decided to fight it in its traditional old way. And so the field artillery's days will obviously return, and the field artillery will make its triumphant return to the history of warfare in 1515 at the Battle of Marignano. Now, France has the best artillery and cavalry in the world, and they're going to be coming up against the Swiss fierce, disciplined Swiss pikemen. Now, the Swiss swarmed towards the French lines in their traditional way, towards a French grand battery of 72 guns, believing, as before, that their elan and flair would overcome the guns in phrases that will be horribly familiar to anyone who studied the early stages of the First World War. Now, as it happens, the Swiss manage to cover the open ground, and they get amongst the guns before the French cavalry manage to drive back the Swiss blocks. Now, the French tried to then continue driving the Swiss back, but the Swiss pike blocks managed to hold firm and halt the cavalry in its tracks. Now, as the day gave way to night, the two sides then pause and pull apart. In the morning, the Swiss again try to swarm across the open ground towards the guns, but point-blank fire halts them in their tracks. And then waves of French cavalry are released against the Swiss pike blocks, but are again repelled again and again by disciplined Swiss pike work. But the guns keep on hammering away at these Swiss pike blocks until eventually the Swiss discipline gives and the Swiss break. The age of Swiss dominance of European warfare is now over. And so now that the field artillery has again started to make its place in the history of European warfare, the next big move forward is the 30 Years' War, as the field artillery becomes more mobile with the work of Gustavus Adolphus. So we're looking at 1618 to 1648. Now, Gustavus Adolphus is seen as what's called the father of modern warfare, and he made Sweden the dominant military power for a century. Now, he reformed the army. Now, all arms of the army were thought of now as equals, and they were cross-trained. And so pikemen are still important to protect the guns while the guns are being reloaded, but the pikemen were also trained as artillerymen. And so if the artillerymen are killed, then some pikemen can take over the guns, and of course vice versa. Now, he equipped the infantry with standard pattern muskets rather than ad hoc whatever guns whatever could be found available. He's now said no, all the army will have the same equipment, and taught them into firing volleys of 2 to 3 ranks, firing as a salvo in the hope that the sudden onslaught of firepower will break the enemy ranks. And so when we think of European armies forming themselves into night-and-east lines and firing by ranks, volley fire, it's the idea of Gustavus Adolphus. And the cavalry are again trained as shock cavalry, abandoning the tactics of the Carroral. Now, previously the cavalry, now you've got them in, it's a gorgeous sight, in full plate armour, but instead of lances they have pistols. So full plate armoured knights with pistols, charging at pike blocks and then trying to gun them down with the pistols. Now, an incredible sight, but a pike can be 16 to 20 foot long, and these pistols are often only lethal to a range of 8 foot. And so the infantry have the rather strange sight of the cavalry riding up to them, stopping at the pike blocks, firing pistols, and then doing no harm, and then running away to reload. It's ineffective. Gustavus Adolphus trains the cavalry once again to act as shock cavalry, to get in with the sword and lance amongst the enemy. Now, the infantry are standing 6 ranks deep, not the 50 ranks deep in the Spanish tercio that they're replacing. With the guns being able to reload quicker, they don't have to be so deep in their ranks, and so they can optimise firepower. And so the Spanish tercio that had dominated the battlefields of the Low Countries and Italy in what we might call the Tudor period are giving way to the Swedish way of war. But most importantly was the artillery. Each brigade had 12 light guns that could move with the infantry and greatly increase their firepower. They're small cannon, very small, but light, so they can be moved around with the infantry. This means that the artillery can now be used on the offensive, because the artillery pieces can travel with the infantry as they attack. These are often referred to as lever cannon, because of the materials that some of them are made of, but they're soon replaced by the 1 to 3 pounder regimental cannons. Their rate of firepower is incredible, actually, it's around 50% faster than that of a musket, and so it can give you some real firepower close in to the lines.